Hi. All right. Well, let's look at ethos, pathos, and logos in regard to this essay. So let's take a look at this. Congressman, Native American, when political correctness runs amok, erasing our history doesn't change it. So let's look at how this author uses ethos, pathos, and logos to try to persuade us that we should not remove these Confederate monuments. So first of all, there's ethos, and I think the writer does a pretty good job of being respectful. People who are respectful to us and our opinions are more likely to gain respect and of opposite people and be more persuasive just by being a respectful person. So rather than referring to his opponents as, you idiots or you morons, why do you think this stupid thing? He refers to them as my colleagues in the Senate and says, well, you have the right to do this as you see fit, but I just disagree. So he starts off with a very mild-mannered, respectful, and open attitude. He's somebody who shares our values. He is clearly not a white supremacist. He's a Native American, and he is very much he objects a lot to these white supremacists who also want to keep these Confederate monuments. He's also very patriotic, and that comes across very strongly. America doesn't cower behind political correctness. It defiantly and courageously moves forward with its history as a reminder of where we have been. So he's very patriotic, and that's where most people are, especially the viewers and readers where this is published, Fox News. So he comes across as someone who shares our values. He also comes across as someone who understands. This would be very different if it had been written by an old white Southerner. He's someone who understands the suffering that Native Americans have endured, and so he should be able to have some sympathy and empathy for the suffering that African Americans have endured. So I think he shows a pretty good ethos there by being respectful, sharing our values, and understanding. He also has some pathos in here, and especially the appeal to patriotism. Especially the concluding paragraph is very strong in patriotism. And again, this not only shows that he builds his ethos up, but it moves us emotionally to say, yeah, America's a good place. We shouldn't hate America. Then there's logos. Now, I'm going to argue that the logos is his weakest part of his argument. So the essence of his argument is something like this. We should not remove monuments to the Confederacy because we should not erase our history. Okay, that's essentially what he says several times throughout there. Don't forget the history. You got to learn from it. You're going to forget your history if you get rid of these monuments, okay? And we can put this into what's called a syllogism. And by doing this, we can identify that there's a hidden premise here. There's something that he's assuming to be true that has to be true for his argument to follow. So with a syllogism, we write things as a major premise. It's kind of a general statement. We should not erase our history. A minor premise, which is a little more specific usually, monuments are ways to teach and preserve our history. And conclusion, therefore, we should not remove these monuments. Okay, that follows logically. If you take the major premise and the minor premise together, if you accept both of those, the conclusion must follow. And so it's very nice to word arguments like this because you can pick apart and identify the potential weakness in any argument this way. So the first premise, we should not erase our history. I think most people would agree with that. History is important. You got to learn from your mistakes. You got to learn from the past. Monuments are ways of teaching and preserving our history. Now let's think about that premise in a little more detail. Think for a minute, how do we learn about history? We learn from books, articles, recordings, lectures, memoirs, interviews, artifacts, things like that. The writer offers no evidence that these monuments are in fact really good at teaching history. And if you think about it for a little while, you think you probably did not learn about history primarily by looking at monuments. You looked at these other things to learn about history. In fact, monuments are really about glorification of the Confederacy. Look at the statue of Robert E. Lee. Look how big and mighty and solemn he looks. Look at even his horse looks big and mighty and solemn, okay? This is not telling me anything about Robert E. Lee as far as what he was like, what his military capacity was, or his techniques, or his education, or his philosophy, or what he did, or how he treated African Americans. None of that. It's making Robert E. Lee, the General of the South, seem glorious. Other statues, they portray the Confederacy as heroic victims in a lost cause. And that's what these monuments were originally designed to do, to portray the South as a victim in a great and glorious cause. They're not really historical documents. They're not teaching us any facts about history. They're telling us that the Confederacy was great. So really, there's a real problem with that premise, and the writer offers no evidence for the premise that these monuments are good for teaching history, and offers no evidence that if we got rid of these monuments, suddenly we'd forget everything we knew about the South and the Confederacy. And in fact, a little moment's reflection will tell you it's just simply not true. The writer also uses some fallacious reasoning. This is something I'll show you more about later in the semester, but the fallacy here is called a red herring. The idea of a red herring, it came from the idea that a herring, when it was smoked, would turn red, and you could drag it across a trail. If you're being chased by dogs or something, you drag it across the trail, and the dogs would be chasing on your trail. And once they came to the red herring, they go off the topic, off track, and they start chasing something else. So the idea of this is that a red herring is used when you want to distract your reader or your viewer from the relevant or important issue. So the relevant issue is, should we remove these monuments, yes or no? And then he goes into this. Still, we have professional athletes like Colin Kaepernick, who refuses to stand during the national anthem, and others who stand in solidarity with him in protest of the United States. To what end? To protest this country, a country that I love and my friends have died to defend. As an American, you have the right to protest me, or another individual, or a group, but I believe that protesting the United States for the mistakes it has made, when it gave you the freedom to do so in the first place, is disrespectful. Okay. Very moving there, but it's really irrelevant. The people objecting to these Confederate monuments are not protesting the United States. They're saying, let's remove these monuments from public places so that when I go to a park with my children, they don't have to look up and see someone who, an ancestor, somebody who oppressed my ancestors, okay? People shouldn't have to go to a park and see Hitler glorified, right? We wouldn't like that, and I don't think anybody would really want to see somebody that you think supported slavery and was maybe a bad person. You wouldn't want that person glorified in your park. It has nothing to do with objecting to the United States or protesting the United States. So overall, I think the article is pretty nicely done, especially given the audience he's going for. He's trying to appeal to Fox viewers who are probably already going to support this, but it's going to kind of support their already or strengthen their beliefs. It does a pretty good job of using ethos and pathos to persuade the reader. The logos, I think, has some serious weaknesses. But I'm not sure the readers would be too critical of that. I am, though, and I'm a critical reader, and I hope as you go through the semester, you'll start noticing how to take apart arguments, how to look at ethos, pathos, and logos, and identify strengths and weaknesses in any argument. Okay, good work.